I'd like to welcome you to Friday's podcast. We are studying through the book of 1 Corinthians. Today we're in 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, and we're going to pick up with verse number 8. Now, the Apostle Paul has told the Corinthian church, you need to get rid of the leaven. And leaven represents sin in the Bible. And then he makes this statement in verse number 7, you are unleavened. And then he says why they're unleavened. And he adds, for Christ our Passover also has been sacrificed. And now we pick up in verse number 8 because he's talking about the Passover. Now, in case you don't know what the Passover was, the Passover happened while the children of Israel were in Egypt. God is getting ready to rescue them. And he says what you need to do is you need to put the blood of a lamb on the doorpost of your house. And then everybody in your family needs to assemble in that house. And you need to eat a feast. And one of the things of the feast was you need to eat bread without leaven. Unleavened bread. It's almost like sometimes like a cracker almost. You need to eat unleavened bread. And then the angel will pass over your house. And that's why we call it the Passover. But now Paul's saying, therefore let us celebrate the feast. Let's celebrate what Jesus has done for us on the cross. You see, when a church allows sin, or when a person allows sin in their life, you know what they're not doing? They are not celebrating what Jesus has done, how he has sanctified them and cleansed them, how he has freed them from sin. And so Paul says, you know what? Therefore, because of this, because of what Jesus did, let us celebrate the feast. But then he adds this phrase, not with old leaven, not with old sin. And then he goes on, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness. Now, what does the Apostle Paul mean by the leaven of malice and wickedness? The word malice, it actually means something that is habitually wicked in a person's mind. How many of you know that there's two ways of sinning? You can sin in your mind, or you can sin in an act. The Apostle Paul is addressing both of those things. He said with malice, which is a wicked habit in the mind, or with wickedness, which is actually the act of evil or the action of sin. Paul is talking about sin that takes place in a person's mind, and sin that takes place in a person's actions, an action of sin. You know, if you think, well, you know what, I want to steal that. But then you don't steal it, but you're thinking, boy, I'd like to have that, boy, this, and you just continue to turn that thing over in your mind. You know what you're doing? You're doing an act of malice, a sin in the mind. Now, if you go ahead and just take that and put it in your pocket and walk out of the store, you know what? Then you're doing the sin of wickedness. I hope that you understand the differences. And now the Apostle Paul goes on. And he says, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. How do we celebrate Jesus? How do we celebrate what Jesus has done for us on the cross? We do it with unleavened bread. We do it with bread that has no sin, and a life that has no sin. In other words, we are living out what Jesus did for us. But how are we doing that? It says with unleavened bread of sincerity. In other words, we are completely sincere. completely honest with ourselves and with others. How do you live your life out in a church? How do you live your life out? You live your life out with the sincerity that your life is without sin. And then he adds this word, and, or these two words, and truth. Not only with sincerity, but you're sincere in a way that it's absolutely truthful, absolutely honest. You see, the Apostle Paul is saying that we're living our lives in true reality. And we're living our lives where truth is being revealed. It's such a powerful, powerful statement. Now let's move on to verse number 9. The Apostle Paul says, I wrote you in my letter not to associate with immoral people. What is he saying? He's saying, I wrote to you in the letter not to associate with immoral people. But you're saying, well, how do I live in the world if I don't associate with immoral people? Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because in verse 10, the Apostle Paul answers that question. He says, I do not at all mean with immoral people of this world. What's he saying? He's saying, I'm not talking about the immoral people out there. How many of you know that would be an impossibility? How many of you know that if we're going to reach immoral people with the gospel of Jesus Christ, that would make immoral into moral people? How many of you know you got to associate with them? So the Apostle Paul has to clarify what he just said. He said, I'm not talking about the immoral people in the world. And then he goes on and he says, or with the covetous or swindlers or idolaters. For then you would have to go out of the world. In other words, the only way that you're going to ever not be around immoral people is to leave the world. In other words, die. We need to understand that. He's not talking about immoral people or swindlers or covetous people or adulterers that are in the world. He's talking about people in the church. Verse number 11. But actually, I wrote to you not to associate with a so-called brother if he is an immoral person, covetous, adulterer, reveler, drunkard, swindler. Don't even eat with such a one. Now I want us to take a look at some of these words that the Apostle Paul, he says, don't associate with a so-called brother. Now, how many of you know that there are so-called brothers in our churches? They have not committed their lives over to Jesus, but yet they're trying to reap the benefits of being a brother. You understand? And so Paul uses these words so-called, and it means to be a brother in name. That's what the Greek word that's translated so-called into the English. It means a brother in name. Not a brother in action, but just a brother in name. And then he goes on and he says, don't associate with them. Don't bring them into your fellowship. Don't bring them into your koinonia, your fellowship. Don't become partakers with them. Why? Because a little leaven leavens a whole lump, going back to what we talked about earlier this week. And then he says, immoral persons. The word immoral, it means a fornicator. It's the Greek word pornos. It means something that includes homosexuality. It includes pornography. It includes all forms of fornication or or sex outside of marriage, sex, extra-sexual relationships inside of marriage. This word porneo, it's not porneo in this sense, it's pornos in this sense, but it means all types of illegal or immoral sexual activity. What's he saying? He's saying if a man calls himself a brother, but he's a homosexual, don't associate with him. Yeah, I said it. I'm just repeating what the Apostle Paul said. If a man calls himself a brother, but he's having sex with his dad's wife, don't associate with him. Don't become a partaker with him. Don't fellowship with him. Then he goes on and he adds to the list a covetous man. What's a covetous man? It's a man or a person that says, I want more and more and more and more and more and more and more. It's a person that's never satisfied. I know my time is up. I'm getting the signal my time is up, but I'm going to finish this. Or an adulterer. What's an adulterer? A person that worships idols. And then he says, or a reveler. It's a person that uses his mouth to attack someone else. Don't associate with him. Or a drunkard. It's a person who gets drunk on wine. Actually, literally the word is on wine. Or a swindler. Someone who seizes an opportunity to take advantage of someone else. Don't associate with a brother who is one of those things. And then he says, don't even eat with them. Don't even take food with them. Beware. Understand, a little leaven leavens a whole lump. Thank you for watching. Join us again next week as we continue our study in the book of 1 Corinthians.